Okay, it looks like we will just be getting 20-minute videos out of this. Let's go ahead and fire up the multiple bits of recording that we are doing right here. And we're up. Okay, great. So where we left off, we are going to move on to Module 2 PowerPoint. We were looking at a couple of different ideas. So let's see. Phonetics, prosody, no. So this concept of a writing system has come up over and over again throughout the course of our class. So I'm going to write this up on the board. Writing system. So this is actually one of our terms of the trade. This is a language and a script. So the language, for the purposes of our class, is what is actually spoken between persons. So right now I am speaking standard American English. That's the language, and then I am writing in the English script, which uses Latin characters. So that's kind of a combination that works together. Alternatively, I could be speaking Levantine Arabic with you, and then be using the standard Arabic writing system, which uses a script developed in the Middle East several thousand years ago. So yeah, this writing system idea is really pretty crucial. And then there's this idea that you can mix writing systems, which is something that we've been kind of working on a little bit with our course project. We can take a language and pair it with something else. So technically, we should be able to take, say, Mandarin Chinese and put it into English. This is what we call pinyin Chinese, and it's a certain way of communicating using a standard QWERTY keyboard layout. Often used in texting. The same sort of concept goes for leet speak, which takes English and puts it into a different writing system. So we talked about a couple of those different mixtures that are found. Let's see, what else is important? Yeah, so moving on to systems that were created. I've said this time and again, but there is no linear progression of systems that goes from a syllabary to an abjad to an alphasyllabary, an alphabet to a featural system. However, that is how it happened to occur in the timeline of our world. So not originally, there are several different starting points of writing systems. So we have one of those starting points being with the Mayans in Central America, South America area, and we also have a starting point for writing over in East Asia, particularly in southeastern China, and then there's another start to the writing system in northeastern Africa and Mesopotamia. And they were all separate events that occurred. And so there's no real progression. Those different events led to different things. The one that we talked about most started in Mesopotamia, in what we call the cradle of civilization, and progressed eventually into the Greek alphabet, which is where we get our writing system from, because Latin stole much of what they had. So there's no progression of time, but it happened to occur that way. So let's first start with syllabaries. Japanese is perhaps one of our best syllabaries that we've looked at, as well as Mayan a little bit, and Cherokee, which is a little bit more contrived. But the idea is that you can take a grid system and write out all of your vowels and all of your consonants, and then fill in the chart to create different characters for every syllable that is possible. So if you only have consonant and vowel syllables possible in your language, then it will be very straightforward and simple. However, many languages have much more complex phonological systems from that, and you can use consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, or in the case of Russian, you can have 5 consonants in a row followed by a vowel, etc. So I would look at syllabaries. I would also look at the alphabet. The first real alphabet that we get is not Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it's not necessarily Phoenician. So the order of operations that we talked about a little bit in our midterm study group last week was that the Sumerians started out with cuneiform, which was largely logographic and pictographic, and then they handed that system, through trade to the Copts and to the Egyptians, who then handed it back to the Phoenicians, and through trade, the Phoenicians handed it to the Greeks, and the Greeks altered what the Phoenicians handed them, and we ended up with the alphabet of Greek. So I would look at a little bit of that history and a little bit about how alphabets differ from syllabaries. And then definitely know the difference between alphabets and abjads. Alphabets have consonants and vowels. Abjads, well, a pure abjad has just the consonants available to them. However, we talked about how both in Hebrew and Arabic you do certainly have the diacritic marks, which tell you how things should be pronounced, particularly in religious and juvenile literature. And then we talked a little bit about the difference between all of those systems and alphasyllabaries, or abugidas. There are a couple of different terms to know for abugidas. I would take a look in your book to see what those different terms are and how they kind of fit together. That should be important for you. So an important concept being that none of these script types is entirely phonographic. There's no script out there that takes exactly what you say and puts it onto paper. Now, that needs to be qualified a little bit, because there is a possibility for the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, to be used in such a way, but it is not a natural system that's paired with any individual language. We talked about prosody a little bit. I don't know how important that'll be for the midterm. Here's some more ideas about syllabaries. I would definitely go back in your textbook and reread the story on the Cherokee syllabary. We talked about it a little bit in class, but the relationship between the individual who created it, why he created it, and then how that worked with his friend Sam Houston. What was his name? Michael Waters? Anyway. No, Ayoka. And Sequoia are kind of the main characters in that. I think you should be able to find something in your book about it, otherwise you definitely should look about it online. Then we talked about linear B and how when Michael Ventris was dealing with it, he had to define which system he was working with. Was he working with an alphabet? Was it an alphasyllabary, a simple syllabary? And it ended up working out really well because every syllable represents a vowel or a consonant-vowel combination. So it's a fairly decent syllabary for us to deal with Mycenaean, which was developed in Crete. So we talked about that. We talked about Mayan. You definitely don't need to be able to recognize any of these characters. Our midterm will be done in English. Yeah, on slide 27 of the of Module 2, there's a syllabic systems with a link to a story about our Cherokee speaker Sequoia, who came up with his syllabary. Let's see. So yeah, there's some other system types that are important to know, particularly Hangul. The textbook does a really good job of describing how Hangul for Korean is different from others, and we have some pictures as well in the slides that I encourage you to go back and look at. It's a featural system, so it's not necessarily, it's not like the other systems that we've been dealing with. Consonantal systems, Yeah, so we talked about Egyptian for quite a bit, and we had some examples from Omniglot, but the major point to get out of that is that there was a phonetic component and a meaning component. There's a semantic component to it as well. And that comes from the literal signs that we have, as well as the determinatives. So the uniliteral, biliteral, and triliteral signs, they all seem to deal with phonetic components, but the determinatives, the semantic determinatives, have to do solely with the concept that you're dealing with. So there's a star, or you have a symbol for a king, but it doesn't tell you how to pronounce king. You would have that symbol, and then you would have a cartouche of that individual to tell you their name. I wouldn't go too much into the Afroasiatic family tree. However, you do need to understand root and pattern morphology. I'm going to write this out on the board. Root and pattern. I'm going to put a picture that I took up from when I was working with our group last week, the midterm study group, about how literals K, T, and B, kaf, ta, and ba, in Arabic can be turned into writer, written, read, read, and things like that, just by altering how it is placed together. So that's something that generally comes with abjads. A concept that you may want to try and piece together for yourself is whether or not Semitic languages, such as Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and others, whether they utilize abjads because the language lends itself to root and pattern morphology, or whether the root and pattern morphology arose because they decided at some point to use an abjad. That's kind of one of our key concepts, I think, to go over. Talked about abjads, tried to put abjads together from English, etc. I'm just trying to see what else is going to be important for us here. Different alphabets are important. Yeah, definitely look at Hangul. Definitely look at semantophonetic scripts. Okay, so on slide 78 of Module 2, you'll find a comparison of semantophonetic scripts, which are not quite the same as, well, it's very similar to the logophonemic idea that we brought up a little while ago. So cuneiform, which was established by the now I'm messing it up. Not the Phoenicians, but the Sumerians before them, is a logosyllabic group which utilizes the rebus principle. Definitely know what the rebus principle is. And then we have Egyptian hieroglyphics, which use the acrophonic principle. You don't necessarily need to know the difference between those two, but I would go back in the readings and double check the difference between the acrophonic and the rebus principles. Let's see. I do not think... Okay. Starting on slide 83 of Module 2, there is a discussion of different language types. This has very little to do with the scripting types, but because we're talking about writing systems, we have to pair the language with the script. So we first talked about isolating or analytic languages. They're the same idea, and how Chinese works like that there is a symbol for a concept. They're composed of isolated or free morphemes. These free morphemes don't agglutinate, they don't attach to each other, you can't put anything into the middle of them, they are static by themselves. Then there are agglutinative languages like Turkish, which take different morphemes and they place them in certain patterns so that you can form larger concepts. And there's really pretty decent pictures of how those works. Fusional languages are a little bit more known to us. A lot of us speak Spanish, or at least have come into contact with it a lot more. The morpheme boundaries are a lot more difficult to discern. So we have the concept of hablo, I speak in Spanish, or hablamos, right? We speak. I want to say that I'm conjugating that correct. If you speak Spanish and I'm doing it wrong, just please tell me. But certain words and stems will change. So that's a fusional language. I'll go back and look at the notes on that. And then polysynthetic languages, they're very difficult to learn. They often have verbs that express the entirety of a typical sentence. So one verb would tell you a whole lot more. You know, I will catch a tiger just with one word because it's a little bit more intense than just simple agglutination. So type of language can be important. I think that that's really it for important things that come out of Module 2. So let's go ahead and move on to Module 3. Module 3, we're back to decipherment. Decipherment, we were really talking about the scientific process. You know, I don't know if there's a whole lot more on the midterm thinking about it that you need to pull from number 3. I want to get to number 4 before we really run out of time. Go back and remind yourself about the difference between the physis disc and linear B. Yeah, I'm just kind of, let's talk a little bit about the Rosetta Stone. I would definitely reread up a little bit on Champollion and what his influence was on the decipherment process of the Rosetta Stone. So he's on slide 35 of Module 3. Yeah, so I would just go over those slides a little bit. We already talked about cartouches. Sorry, give me a second. Yeah, and then the different inscription types. I don't know, I think a cursory glance of Module 3 would do you really well. Talked about statistics, but it's not super important until later. Yeah, let's move on to Module 4. In Module 4, we finally started talking about literacy and defining that. So in the previous video to this, we defined a little bit more about literacy, how that affected the Greeks. That came out of Quick Write number 4. But there are some modern correlates to literati groups, so like the Académie Française, the Merriam-Webster group, and we talked about some other groups that are trying to curtail language expansion to keep it static, to make rules about how it should go. And this is where we really get our idea about what do we call it? Prescriptive grammar. That there are governing bodies that look down on language variation and change and want to hold it static so that more people can be literate. That's kind of an important concept to think about. How, you know, we're making new words all of the time, but only some of them are canonized. You know, and who is it that's saying that's a real word? Is it the people? Is it some resource like Urban Dictionary, or is it the man? Is it, you know, some stuffy old white dude sitting in an office saying, yeah, we'll put this one into the Merriam-Webster dictionary? Yeah, definitely understand what about the size of the literate populations, and how to define literacy, how to compare literate and illiterate societies. Yeah. Okay, so a lot of you already know my opinions about Hannah's logic about the creativity gap, and we talked a little bit about the creativity gap, my idea being that it comes down to the schooling system, the educational methodologies that are used, as opposed to the script itself. Some people want to say that Chinese curtails creativity because it is an isolating or an analytic type language, and it's not synthetic, it's not agglutinative, there's no fusional elements to it, and so you miss out on some creative elements. It's a big debate. You know my opinions about it, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, definitely go over that Hannah paper, understand how Rongo works, how the reverse Boustrephedon writing system can work, and just largely understand how there are differences that do not necessarily define how you deal with language. There's a very famous hypothesis that comes out of linguistics school of thought from several decades ago, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that your language dictates how you view the world. And I do not entirely agree with that claim, but there are many who would say that if you grew up as an L1 speaker, as your first language, knowing Japanese, then your world is shaped by it. And we talked a little bit about how there are certain languages in sub-Saharan Africa, Bantu languages, which see the world in a different linear perspective to a Western mind, perhaps, that they see that the future is behind them, and you move kind of backwards into it, and as you pass through time, more comes into your view, and you can actually see what's going on.